Good afternoon, and welcome again to the 38th Annual Frank Church Conference on Democracy on the Brink, the View from the Mountain West, sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Gary Wenske, and I'm the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. This year's conference focuses on a major survey underwritten by the Frank Church Institute of some 1,900 residents of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada on democracy issues. The survey, done by the respected firm Morning Consult in Washington, D.C., will be the focus of the discussion. This afternoon's panel will address the topic, The View from Idaho, moderated by Dr. Vanessa Fry, the Interim Director of the Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State University. She also serves as Associate Research Professor in the School of Public Service and as an Adjunct Faculty Member at Presidio Graduate School in San Francisco. Joining her on the panel is Rod Grammer, President and CEO of Idaho Business for Education. Previously, he was a reporter and editor of the Idaho Statesman and Executive News Director for KTVB Boise. He was also a television station executive in Portland, Oregon, and Tampa, Florida. He is the co-author of Fighting the Odds, The Life of Senator Frank Church, and serves on the board of the Frank Church Institute. The third panelist, again this afternoon, is Jennifer Mcdonald, Senior Director of Morning Consult, a leading research firm in Washington, D.C., that conducted the survey of the Mountain West. She will present the survey results. Let's begin with Vanessa Fry.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to spend some time talking with Rod and Jen during our discussion this afternoon. And I wanted to extend a thank you to Frank Church Institute. We supplied some technical assistance in their development of the survey that Morning Consult fielded, and really happy to be here sharing time with Jen this afternoon to hear about the Idaho specific results. And so how this is going to work is Jen's going to present a section of the results, and then Rod and I are going to have a bit of a conversation, and we'll also be fielding questions from the audience. So make sure to put your questions out there for us, and we'll get to as many as possible. And then we'll move on to the next section. So right now we're going to get started with Jen. So I'm going to hand it over to Jen.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I have the pleasure of walking you through some of the recent data that we collected in Idaho for Frank Church Institute. But before we begin, for those of you who did not join the morning session, just a quick overview of who Morning Consult is. We are a global data intelligence company that's delivering insights on what people think in real time. So we've been able to help executives at associations, nonprofits, universities, and companies collect, organize, and share data in real time using our scale, data quality, and speed. So when it comes to our scale, we're doing 20,000 interviews a day across the 15 biggest global economies, and that list is continuing to expand. Our data quality and sample design is trusted by everyone from the Frank Church Institute to the New York Times to the Federal Reserve. And our speed is unprecedented. When a crisis strikes or when a moment becomes opportune, we come in and out of the field within 48 hours or less. Just a quick overview of what we learned in the morning session. The research we shared this morning was conducted by Morning Consult on behalf of the Frank Church Institute, and it really sought to understand the perceived state of democracy, including health and concern, and actionable solutions to help strengthen democracy. The research was conducted in 5 different states: Idaho, Nevada, Montana, Wyoming, and Utah. And from this research, we learned that adults in key states tested are concerned about the health of democracy in the United States. We identified specific concerns related to the health of democracy, like representation in government and misinformation, legitimacy of elections, and ability to find common ground. And we found that solutions to strengthen democracy both emphasized a broad need for reform, such as accountability in politics, as well as grassroots strategies like civic education and encouraging conversation. This afternoon, we're going to do a deep dive into the results from Idaho. So the poll was conducted between mid-September and mid-October among a sample of 400 adults in Idaho. The interviews were conducted online, and there's a margin of error of plus or minus 5 percentage points. Some of the key findings that we found throughout this Idaho research pretty well mimic the key findings that we saw earlier today. We saw that while concern over the health of democracy is higher at the United States level at large, most Idaho adults are also concerned about the health of democracy in their own state. In line with key findings from all states that we talked about this morning, Idaho adults are worried about some of the key concepts in democracy, like representation and communication and political polarization, elections, political violence surrounding elections. But these adults in Idaho really do see solutions. They see that solutions can come from broad reform. It can also come from grassroots strategies. So we'll talk more about those later on. Like Vanessa mentioned, similar to what we saw this morning, I'll really just be going kind of section by section. I'll be pausing in between most of the sections to allow Rod and Vanessa to add their comments and insights. So starting off with the health of democracy, we asked a really broad question. Generally speaking, would you say that things in the country and in Idaho are generally headed in the right direction, or do you feel things are headed off on the wrong track? And 3/4 of adults in Idaho say they think things in the country are headed off on the wrong track. Republicans in Idaho are almost twice as likely as Democrats to say that things are headed off on the wrong track in the country. So we see Democrats 46% say wrong track, Republicans at 88%. When it comes to how things are going in the state of Idaho specifically, Idaho adults are split on whether they think things are generally headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track. 52% of adults say right direction, country's going in a good way. 48% say that they feel like things aren't going so well. And contrary to the views seen at the country level, Republicans are actually less likely than Democrats to say things in Idaho are generally headed off on the wrong track. So Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say things are going well in Idaho. Next, we asked a really key question: how concerned are you, if at all, about the health of democracy in each of the following? And approximately 9 in 10 adults in Idaho say that they are concerned about the health of democracy in the United States. Most Idaho adults are concerned also about the health of democracy in their own state as well. So 52% say very concerned at the United States level. 87% say that that's their total level of concern at the United States level. But we also see a majority say that they're concerned at the state level as well. Republicans are just slightly more likely than Democrats to be concerned about the health of democracy at the United States level. But at that state level, when it comes to health of democracy, Democrats are actually more likely than Republicans to say that they are concerned. When we ask specifically where some of that concern is coming from, we learned that 3/4 or more of Idaho adults say that the spread of misinformation, money in politics, politically motivated violence, the influence of elites, media, political polarization, social media platforms, and a lack of civic engagement are all concerning for democracy in the US. But really, all of the options that we tested here, we're seeing at the 50% mark or higher. So lots of reasons why Idaho adults are concerned about democracy in the US. So I'm just going to pause here to hand it over to Vanessa and Rod to talk through their perceptions of health of democracy in Idaho, and then I'll jump back into the next section of data.
Great, thanks, Jen. And as a reminder for those of you in the audience, if you have any questions, please pop them out there for us. But right now I'm going to ask, and the way this is going to work, it's kind of like Rod and I are having a conversation, right? And so it's kind of fun. So it's almost like I'm going to be interviewing him. So Rod, we just saw these slides that Jen presented. We saw the slides from this morning. So why do you think how Idahoans feel about the United States as a whole and our state? Why is that varying? Why do you see that as being an issue? Why don't they feel the same about both the country as a whole and our state alone?
Yeah, Vanessa, it's a great question. I think that if you look at the survey here, you really see the state, the Idahoans sort of splitting along partisan lines. But the interesting numbers for independents, I find very interesting. I'll get to that in a second. But I'm not surprised. I'm stunned that there's such a dissatisfaction with what's going on. I mean, even almost 50% of Democrats think that the country's heading in the wrong direction, even though the Democrats control all branches of the government except the Supreme Court. And so, but when you really stop and think about it, people in Idaho have a lot of reasons to be concerned about the direction of the country. We're going through the worst pandemic in 100 years. We're still not out of that. Per capita, we have one of the highest death rates and infection rates in the United States. In fact, we have more people. In early November, we had more people who had passed away from COVID in Idaho than in the state of Utah, even though Utah has twice our population. The other thing is that inflation is taking off. People pay strict attention to the price of gas. Seems to be an easy way to decide whether things are going in the right direction or the wrong direction. So I'm really not surprised that the numbers are so high. I find it striking that the independents in Idaho, and independents make up the second largest voting bloc in the state of Idaho, more than the Democrats and almost as many as the Republicans in our state. So independents are pretty important in Idaho. And independents are like 74% not happy with what's going on in the country. And I find it really striking that 56% of the independents in Idaho are unhappy with what's going on in the state of Idaho. I think that those two numbers are very key because those people tend to be nonpartisan more. They may lean Republican, may lean Democrat, but for the most part, they're ticket splitters. And so I think as you look at the independent votes, that's very, very significant, those feelings.
Thanks, Rod. So that's kind of the state as a whole. What's the direction looking like? How are we doing? What about how people are feeling about the health of democracy, right? So if we narrow down and we think of just the state of democracy, both in the country and in Idaho, what do you see in the results?
Well, when I first saw the survey a few weeks ago or a few days ago, I was amazed at the depth of despair, and I use the word despair about the health of democracy in our country. It is alarming to me. There's has to be when you get 9 out of 10 people here in Idaho saying that they're worried about the future of democracy. That's a consensus, whether it's a Democrat, independent, or Republican. I find that very amazing and very dangerous and also very concerning. But even they're concerned about democracy in our state, Idaho. Almost 6 out of 10 Idahoans are concerned about democracy in our state. So again, when you can get 6 out of 10 people to agree to almost anything, that means it's cutting across political lines. It means the independents are concerned. So these numbers are very disconcerting, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, that's I don't think it's anything that I've kind of ever seen, at least in my time following the country and the state of Idaho, having that much of a concern over democracy. What about the reasons behind that concern? So that's something else that Morning Consult asked. Okay, we got your level of concern. Now give us some information about why is that concern present? So when you look at those results, what do you see there?
Well, I see a lot of consensus there too. And I know we're going to get to this a little later in our conversation, but the spread of misinformation, money in politics, politically motivated violence, the influence of elites, media, and political polarization all test well over 50%. And so the people of Idaho, like the people in the country, seem to have a consensus around some of the things that are really ailing our democracy, both here in Idaho and nationally. So there's bad news in that, and there's good news in that, and I know we'll probably talk about that later in the discussion.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know me well, I'm a glass half full kind of person, and so I'm really excited. At the end of our conversation, we're going to talk about the opportunities, right? What are the highlights that we can take from this, and think about how we can move forward and strengthen our democracy, right? So we'll get there. That's in the future. So don't leave in despair. Brad and I are going to get there.
We're going to end on a high note, aren't we?
We are going to end on a high note. And Jen, you are up next. We're going to talk about representation in government now.
Great. That sounds good. So moving on, the slides that I'm about to show, we'll talk about fairness of representation in government for Idaho adults, as well as trust and confidence in government. The first question that we asked was, how much confidence do you have in each of the following, if any, to act in the best interests of the public? We asked about judges, your local government, the U.S. Supreme Court, your state government, the presidency, Congress, and federal government. And similar to what we saw in the previous section when it came to federal versus state perceptions, Idaho adults are more likely to have confidence in their local and state government than they are to have confidence in Congress or the federal governments, those more national options. And keeping again with the same themes when it comes to party breakouts, Democrats are more likely than Republicans to have confidence in the federal government, but the opposite is true when it comes to the Idaho state government. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to have confidence in their state government to act in the best interest of the public. Moving on, we asked, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the services you receive from the following: your local government, your state government, and your federal government? In Idaho, adults are more likely to say they're satisfied with the services they receive from their local government and state government compared to those that they receive from the federal government. Next, we asked, please indicate if you believe each of the following groups of people get treated fairly or unfairly by the federal government, the state government, and the local government. We asked about elites, people in urban areas, everyday people, and people in rural areas. And Idaho adults are more likely to say everyday people and people in rural areas are treated mostly unfairly at the federal level. As we get more local, fairness increases. So Idaho adults are more likely to say everyday people and people in rural areas are treated fairly at the state and local level. And Idaho adults believe that elites are treated fairly at all three levels of government tested. We also asked about inclusion and influence in politics. So looking specifically at inclusion, we asked if adults feel alienated from politics or not. We asked them to rate how often they feel alienated by the federal government, politics generally, their representatives in Congress, their senators, and then also their state and local government. And like you would probably expect, given the themes that we've seen today, half or more adults in Idaho say that they feel alienated at least some of the time by all of the options that we tested. 2/3 say that they feel alienated by politics just generally. And I also want to point out that 3/4 say they feel alienated by the federal government. And that perception of alienation actually crosses party lines. So 72% of Democrats and 76% of Republicans say that they often or sometimes feel alienated from the federal government. And then finally in this section, influence. We asked whether or not adults residing in urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas have enough influence in national politics. And you can see pretty clearly from the chart that we have up that Idaho adults are less likely to say that people in rural areas have enough influence in politics compared to those in suburban or urban areas. So only 25% of adults in Idaho say that those in rural areas have enough influence. That perception of lack of influence is really being driven by Republicans in this case. Only 18% of Republicans say that people in rural areas have enough influence in politics. I'm going to pause again for Vanessa and Rod to provide their feedback on the data.
All right, thanks, Jen. So when we look at that first slide that Jen presented, Rod, what do you see in there that might be striking to you? Is there something that really stands out?
Well, throughout this whole section, Vanessa, there's this split between the three levels of government, right? Let's just say clearly that the federal government does not fare so well in this survey, and I'll get to that in a second. People are more confident in their state government, although there's some issues there, and of course they're more likely to think that the local government is more responsive and cares about them more. I think starting with the federal government, Idaho historically has always had this love-hate relationship with the federal government. So one of the reasons we don't like the federal government in Idaho, besides the fact that we're just a bunch of independent cusses here in our state, is that more than 60% of the state is owned by the federal government. And a lot of people in Idaho view the federal government as an absentee landlord that really doesn't care about them. On the other hand, Idaho was really, in many ways, built with federal support. First of all, our land-grant college, university at the University of Idaho, predated statehood. If you look at the Treasure Valley here, we would not have the agricultural production that we have in this valley without Arrow Rock Dam, which was the very first federal dam built in the United States in the early 1900s. We wouldn't have the diversion dam. We wouldn't have Lucky Peak, which controls the flooding along the Boise River. Look at the Magic Valley, all the land that was put into production because of the federal government. So, in other words, we have benefited a lot from the federal government. And even recently, while Governor Little is criticizing the federal relief funds that President Biden is passing, we're taking those funds and we're distributing those and helping fund the Idaho economy at the same time. So we have this tremendous sort of Jekyll and Hyde sort of relationship with the federal government. And we love the federal lands, right? We love to hike and ski and hunt and fish and snowmobile on the federal lands. So, but that streak has been in Idaho for forever, and it's probably not going to go away. In the state government, it seems that it's striking that there is even there sort of a high level of dissatisfaction with the state government. And that's kind of striking since, we're a Republican state and our whole state government is controlled by the Republican Party. It's no surprise to me that local government gets higher marks here. Local government is closer to the people. Local government, you're more likely to run into your city council person or your school trustee or even your mayor in the grocery store, especially in rural Idaho, smaller towns. And even here in Boise, it's not unusual to see members of your city council, school board, or Mayor McLean walking around downtown Boise. So people feel closer to the local government. The other thing that historically with local government here in the state of Idaho, and it's not true in other states, is that our local offices are all nonpartisan. There's never an R, there's never a D behind the names of the mayor or the city council people or the school trustees. Now, I do want to say, however, that this last election, I'm kind of hoping that we can continue to have faith in our local elected officials. But they took a huge hit during the pandemic and still are, because much of the decision making about what to do with the pandemic was pushed down by state leaders to the local level. So that put a lot of pressure on our local elected officials. And this last election in November, this month, was the most partisan election I have ever seen in Idaho politics. It was almost as though some of the people running for school board or city council had an R behind their name and some have a D behind their name. That is a new development in Idaho politics that, by the most part, you've never seen before. So I think the real danger in Idaho is that this dysfunction that we see in Washington is starting to spread to our state house here in Boise, but it's also starting to spread to our local governments. And it'd be a real shame if we saw our local government races become as polarized and as partisan as we have at especially the federal level.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Rod, about what you were saying about the partisanship that seemed to be in place for this last election cycle. It was, I like to follow the mailings that go out and just kind of pay attention to them and collect them. And you could almost stack them, when you had the parties doing the mailings and then you had candidates do the mailings, the language was very similar, with some of those mailings. And so definitely much more partisanship, it seemed, even without the R&D right next to someone's name. And, that relationship we kind of just talked about, the satisfaction and also how much confidence, right, that people have in different levels of government. So when we think about how people perceive government is treating them either fairly or unfairly, right? We asked about different kind of classes of people, right? And how the perception of our respondents were regarding how government was treating different sets of individuals. What are your comments on that?
Well, there are two things I'd like to focus on with this slide. The first is the elites, whomever those people are taking a real beating in this survey, both here in Idaho and nationally. There's a very strong dislike of people in power, I guess you might say. That too is not new for Idaho. Idaho has historically been we've had a populist thread throughout our politics since statehood. A lot of people in Idaho may not know this, but the very first election we could participate in as Idahoans was 1892, and Idaho actually voted for the populist candidate for president over the Republican and the Democrat. And in 1896 and 1900, Idaho voted for William Jennings Bryan, who was called the Great Commoner, and he was a prairie populist. And Idaho went for him both in the 1896 election and they went for him in the 19 election. And if you look at some of the political leaders in our state, Frank Church even comes to mind, and William Borah comes to mind. They had sort of a populist philosophy about politics as well. When I say populist, I don't mean the Donald Trump variety of populism, but this tremendous sort of grassroots faith in the people sort of populism. Idaho was in the early 1900s one of the leading progressive states in the country. We gave women the right to vote in 1896, 24 years before the country did. So, we've always had this sort of anti-elite, sort of commoner sort of streak in our politics. The other thing I'd like to focus on in this section is this real split between urban and rural. In Idaho, we've always had this, the rural people have always been sort of discounting the people in the urban areas. There's this saying about the great state of Ada, that the rural people look at Boise and frown at Boise and the urban area. And I used to see this in the legislature a lot back in the 70s and 80s. The split wasn't so pronounced between Democrats and Republicans as it is now. It was more along urban and rural. I remember covering the legislature in the 1970s, and you'd have the so-called cowboys from the rural areas voting one way, and they could be Democrats or Republicans. And you'd have the so-called city slickers voting together and they are Democrats and Republicans. In fact, when Governor Andrus was governor in his first two terms, one of his strongest supporters in the legislature was Dean Summers, who represented the north end of Boise. He was a Republican chair of the State Affairs Committee. So this urban-rural split has always been here in Idaho, and I think it's getting even more pronounced now. And I think you see this in the research. And I think it's because in Idaho, all you have to do is drive through rural Idaho to know it's hurting. I'm very familiar with many of the small towns in Idaho, and you can drive down many of the main streets, and I know one town in the Magic Valley in particular very well, and it used to have two drugstores. It used to have a bowling alley. It used to have a theater. It used to have a car dealership. You drive down that same main street today, and there's no drugstores. There's no furniture stores. There's no bowling alley. There's no theater. There's no car dealer. But the urban areas, the Coeur d'Alenes and the Boise's and the Idaho Falls, we're doing pretty darn well economically. Tampa and Caldwell and Meridian. So this split between the rural and urban areas, I think, is becoming more pronounced. And a lot of that has to do with how the economies are doing in the urban versus rural areas.
Yeah, I was just looking back at the slide, and the numbers for everyday people and people in rural areas when it comes to like who's treated most unfairly. It everyday people kind of overlaps with people in rural areas. I can't say that's because when people think of everyday people, they think of people in rural areas, but must be some commonality there, right? If people's perception of who is treated unfairly are kind of everyday people and people in rural areas. I think that's kind of interesting. It's something I didn't notice in the data before.
Yeah. And, you're starting to see that in the legislature, where you recall the Republican leadership wanted to expand the number of districts in the state so that we could keep electing more rural legislators. And the fear is that as the population areas grow, that the rural areas are going to suffer politically and the urban areas are going to become more dominant. What's really interesting about that, though, is that take Ada County, for example. Roughly at Cloverdale Road, we basically have two different parties in Ada County, maybe more. But if you take Cloverdale Road, almost everything east of that is controlled by Democratic legislators. Everything west of Cloverdale Road, roughly, is controlled by Republican legislators. And many of those Republican legislators in western Ada County vote more like they're from Idaho County or Boise County or Camas County. They vote very much, very, very conservative, and they very much vote against urban interests, even though their city, Meridian, is the fastest growing city in Idaho and is soon to surpass 100,000 people. They vote more like they're from some of the rural parts of the state. So it's not a clean break, if you will.
Yeah, so we've got a question here from the audience. Why do people think rural folks are mistreated by government when statistics show they have a higher level of political representation relative to urban people? So, Rod, what do you think about that?
There's a lot of paradox in politics, I think. So I'll use two. First one is that for every dollar that Idaho people send to the federal government, we get much more money back. We are one of those states that has a net. We get more money back from the federal government than we send, and yet we have this terrible feeling about the federal government, right? And to me, that's a huge. I've always been puzzled by that because we really benefit a lot from federal dollars flowing into our state. The second thing that's kind of a paradox, I think, is that the legislature is dominated by rural interests. And I just used the Ada County example, right? One could hardly say that Western Ada County is rural anymore. Yeah, we have some farming, but when I grew up in Boise, I mean, everything out there. My cousin and my had a dairy farm on Locust Grove. That dairy farm doesn't exist anymore. So Western Ada County is far from the rural county it was when I grew up in Boise. And yet those legislators vote like rural, many of them vote like rural legislators. So there's an incredible power structure in our state. Our governor is from Emmett. Our speaker is from Oakley. Now our pro tem is from Western Ada County, but if you look at the chairs of the key committees, most of them are from rural areas. They're not from urban areas. So the rural people really are not all that well represented in the legislature, especially when you can consider that some urban legislators vote more like rural legislators.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Rod. One of the things we were all curious about when Frank Church Institute was first working with Morning Consult on this study, we were wondering, do people who live in urban areas feel differently than people that live in rural areas. We didn't know. And so it looks like when Morning Consult ran the crosstabs on that, they really didn't show any significant difference between people's viewpoints from those that lived in the urban areas than those that lived in the rural areas. But I think it's getting to what you just said, Rod, that it's maybe that's not as much of a dividing line as it used to be, because we see people who are living in urban areas voting what we would traditionally consider being like rural votes, right? And so it was just something that we were really curious about when we started the study was, is there going to be a difference? Is that going to be the dividing line between people's viewpoints?
Well, you look at Canyon County. Canyon County has the third largest city or second largest city in the state. Nampa. Meridian is the third. I think they're probably going to change places here. But the legislators from those areas vote like rural legislators. You'd be hard pressed to find any philosophical difference between most of the Canyon County legislators and a lot of the legislators from other places, although there are exceptions. Steve Ahrens, who used to be political editor of the Statesman before I was, he used to say when we're always doing redistricting back in those days, he used to say, if you cut a cherry pie, you get cherries, and if you cut the state of Idaho, you get Republicans. And I've always thought that is so true. No matter how you divide Idaho, you're going to get more Republicans than Democrats. Now, like I said, independents make up the second largest bloc in Idaho, but frankly, when you cut up the state of Idaho for Congress or for legislature, by and large, you're going to get Republicans, and by and large in Idaho, you're going to get conservative Republicans. It's just a matter of degrees of how conservative. And we can talk about that because that's a pretty significant trend here in Idaho, but we can get into that at some point.
Yeah, and it looks like Peter might help us get into that. He's real curious about what about the division within parties, whether you look at the Democrats in Idaho or the Republicans, does the division within parties, do you think that could have an impact on overall concerns about Idaho government?
Well, that's what I was going to get to. There are at least two Republican parties in Idaho. And actually, I think there might be three. The first one, of course, are the traditional Republicans, right? And you might say that's the Butch Otter, Brad Little wing of the Republican Party. And then you've got what I call the far right Republicans. And that's driven by the Idaho Freedom Foundation these days more than anything. And you can count maybe 20 of those folks in the House of Representatives, which is a lot of people for that caucus. Then there are a lot of legislators kind of in the middle. They tend to be more traditional Republicans, but they're scared to death of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. So oftentimes they vote like the Idaho Freedom Foundation just simply because they're afraid they're going to get somebody to run from the right. So you've got at least three different blocks in the legislature. I always think that it's that middle block that you've got to win over, because you've got some legislators that are always going to support education. They're always Republicans I'm talking about now, will support education. Then you've got some on the other side that won't, and other forward-looking policies. But that middle group and that's where we're losing the battle right now to the Freedom Foundation is they've got a lot of legislators on the run. And that's why you're seeing some legislation pass that maybe many years ago would not have passed. The Democratic Party, interestingly enough, I think is more homogeneous now than ever. And maybe that's because there are so few Democrats in the legislature. But I remember back in the 70s, especially, you had Cy Chase from St. Mary's. Cy was the minority leader of the Senate. He was a very conservative guy. You had legislators from the Clearwater Valley, Democrats. When I first covered the legislature, there was no Republican north of the Salmon River. Then Tom Boyd got elected in Moscow, so he was the single Republican north of the Salmon River. And now there's one or two Democrats north of the Salmon River. And at one point, it was Paulette Jordan was the only Democrat north of the Salmon River. So politics in Idaho and when I started covering the legislature, there was only one Democrat in Ada County, and that was Ron Twilliger. And he was from the North End. And now pretty much every district that's in Boise proper is controlled by a Democrat. So even in the Democratic Party, that maybe 40 years ago, you had a significant number of conservative Democrats. You don't have as many conservative Democrats in the legislature as we did in the 70s and the 80s. One more thing I might just, before I forget about it, back in the 1980s, the Republican Party was split back in those days too, and it was even more pronounced than it is now. And in the 1980s, there was a group of Republican legislators. Mike Simpson was one of those. Chris Hooper from West Boise was one of those. They became known as the Steelhead Caucus. And it was it was a caucus within the Republican caucus called the Steelhead Caucus. It was really and we had a very conservative Speaker of the House at the time. It was really the Steelhead Republicans and the Democrats that got almost everything passed in the House of Representatives. Now, you don't see that kind of bipartisan working together as much as you used to, because everybody wears their jersey, their team jersey, and they pretty much vote party lines. But back in those days, you had a lot of Republicans working with the Democrats, and it wasn't necessarily city people. There were a lot of Republicans from rural places in Idaho that were part of the Steelhead Caucus. So anyway, things have really changed politically, and I've seen that happen over the last several decades.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has changed probably in a much shorter period of time is this concept of misinformation. So we saw in an earlier slide that was the largest concern that our respondents had regarding the threat of democracy in the U.S. And so let's move on to that section with Jen's slide deck.
Great, thank you. Like Vanessa, like you mentioned, we do see that misinformation is a huge concern when it comes to the health of democracy. But we wanted to go a little bit deeper than that. We wanted to know if this is something generally that people are worried about. And if so, who do people think are responsible in Idaho? And we see that almost all adults across party lines are worried to some extent about misinformation and misrepresentation of facts. When we asked who's responsible, is it the liberal media? Is it the conservative media? Is it both? Is it neither? Do people just not know what's going on? Who would be responsible? We see that about half of Idaho adults say both liberal media and conservative media are equally responsible for misinformation and misrepresentation of facts. 1/4 say that it's mostly the liberal media. Of course, we see some sides being taken here, some partisanship. 43% of Republicans say it's the liberal media to blame. 31% of Democrats say that it's the conservative media to blame. So adults in Idaho are more likely to blame the media of the party that they are not a part of. A very quick section, but I think that this will start some good conversation.
Thanks, Jen. So Rod, as Jen said, quick section here, but there's a lot of mistrust in the media, right? That is something that we're seeing at a really high level, and it definitely seems, at least in Idaho to some extent, which type of media is that concern is a party line concern. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Vanessa, this is, for me, having been a journalist for so long, is very worrisome. Whenever you can get 84% of the people say that misinformation is a problem, and when you get 86% to say misrepresentation of the facts is a problem. I've often said that that the founding fathers put a lot of weight into information. The only profession that the founders mentioned in the U.S. Constitution was the freedom of the press. It was the only profession they literally wrote into the Constitution. And they did that because they believed so much that information and knowledge and education and information was so key to the survival of a democracy, that they wanted to make sure it was enshrined in the Constitution, in the First Amendment of the Constitution, so that the electorate would become knowledgeable about the issues. They had this great faith in the people that if they knew what the issues were, they knew what the facts were, they knew what the truth was, they would make the right decision, and that democracy would flourish. One has to question right now, if we are now in a new era where that is virtually impossible for the electorate to become informed, to become knowledgeable, when they don't believe in facts, they don't believe in science, they don't believe in the messengers that they're getting. And so you can imagine that for somebody that dedicated a better part of their life trying to report the news and provide people the information they needed to make a wise decision, this is very, very concerning to me. And I'm not giving the media a hall pass, and because I believe the media is largely at fault here, or at least contributor to it. But social media and the internet have definitely exacerbated this problem in a big way. I remember Edward R. Murrow used to say that, unless we use the television right, it was just a box full of wires and tubes. But same can be said for the internet and social media. Social media and the internet could be a powerful tool for knowledge, for information. It could be one of the best things that ever happened to us in terms of communicating with people and gaining knowledge and information. But just like the TV, if you don't use that wisely, it can actually become a weapon against democracy. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is that the social media and the internet are becoming weaponized and really undermining our democracy and our faith in democracy. So there's a lot we need to do here. I am heartened that a good percentage of people blame both the liberal media and the conservative media, because I think there's a lot I think that's true. But it's pretty interesting that the conservatives or the Republicans are not as hard on the conservative media as they are on the liberal media, and vice versa, probably. I would like to talk a little bit about how we got to this, and I don't know if you want to go there. But
yeah, I do, and I just just to kind of bring some context. So I'm a mother of two young girls, and when I think about what I was, the media I was introduced to as a child back in the 80s and 90s is much different than what my children are seeing today. I used to sit in front of the news hours with my grandparents, and it seemed like a very trusted, wholesome experience in some ways. And I look back at that today, and my husband and I don't sit down and watch the news, right? We might be looking at our individual feeds, and our girls are just kind of connecting with the internet through social media, sort of. But it's frightening because it's hard to even know how to help people discern what is truth and what is not truth because of everything that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, there was the day, it seems quaint now and distant in the distant past, Walter Cronkite, who was the anchor for CBS Evening News, was the most trusted person in the United States, more than the president, more than any member of Congress. The American people every year rated him the most trusted person. Back in those days, we used to have NBC had Brinkley, Huntley and Brinkley, and CBS had Cronkite. And then eventually ABC had a network newscast. And Americans would sort of gather around the hearth, if you will, and watch Cronkite or watch Brinkley, Huntley and Brinkley, or Peter Jennings. And for the most part, they had a lot of faith in what those anchors were saying. Same with local news. I remember almost every survey when I was in local television news said that people trusted their local TV news more than almost any other media outlet. But a couple things have happened besides the birth of social media and online, where we know all those problems, right, with Facebook and everybody. But I want to comment on traditional media here for a second. Two things have happened that I think contributed to where we are today. The first is that when broadcasting started in the 1920s with radio and then expanded to television, we had a federal law called the Fairness Doctrine. So if you were a broadcaster and you had a Democrat on, you had to have a Republican on. If you were talking about a certain issue, you had to give both sides of that issue, essentially equal time. So there was a balancing act, a balancing out in the broadcast media because of the Fairness Doctrine. But in the 1980s, when we had this like big push for deregulation, airlines and everything else, we repealed the Fairness Doctrine in the late 1980s. And so there's no policy now that says that if you have a Democrat on, you have to have a Republican or vice versa. Or if you're taking an issue, you've got to have both sides. So that. When I was editorial page editor of the Statesman, my television folks will hate me for saying this, I editorialized against the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. About a year later, I became executive news director at KTVB. But in my heart, I still followed the Fairness Doctrine and always did. So that was a really bad thing that we did, repealing that. I think we need to restore that. But the second thing, and this is the real troublesome thing, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine coincided with the growth of 24-hour cable news. And so these cable news stations started. First was CNN, Ted Turner, and then came Fox, and then NBC wanted to get in the game and started MSNBC. And then they started putting all these talking heads on TV. And I can tell you that it is much easier and cheaper to have a bunch of talking heads on your 24-hour news than it is to go out and do real journalism, real reporting, real investigative reporting. And they have 24 hours to fill. So what they do is they bring a bunch of people in and they let them just fly off, their opinions on everything. And now you've got personalities on cable news that are even worse than the people they were bringing on when it comes to opinion. And so what happens is now the tribes or the teams have all gathered in front of their own cable news station, the Fox people, and now we've got Newsmax and we got other ultra-conservative news outlets. And the liberals have MSNBC and even CNN, which used to be a sleepy news organization doing real journalism. It's even getting into the act now. So cynically, I think that a lot of people have made a lot of money by just putting a bunch of talking heads on these cable news stations instead of doing real journalism. And as a former journalist, I hate that. And I think that cable news is really the worst thing that's ever happened to our country. And you're never going to be able to put that genie back in the thing. But I'll just say this, that the founding fathers had a tremendous faith in the American people. It was the bedrock of their belief in democracy. But they knew that if the American people and the citizens of this country didn't get informed, did not look at information critically, did not know what they were voting for, and they would look at both sides of the issues. If they didn't do those things, the founding fathers, I knew, would be really concerned about the direction of democracy. And that's where we are right now. And I think this survey is a wake-up call for those in the media, those who run social media, and those that control the internet. They really have to have a wake-up call here because they're losing the American people, and then we're going to lose our democracy.
Yeah, and when we think of the some literature points to certain tenets of democracy. So we've kind of talked about how the citizenry feels empowered or not, right? We saw that in some of, they feel alienated. We are going to be talking about elections next. We've talked about responsiveness to policy, right? How responsive are different levels of government to your needs? And now this idea of information and communication and what you pointed to, that, the founders of this country recognized how important it was to have all people have access to media that was accurate and trusted, right, and had a fair process. And it sounds like when that Fairness Doctrine was revoked, right, that kind of took that piece away and took away the ability of our country to kind of govern for that piece of what really points to a strong democracy when we have fair and free information and communication. So, yeah. Oh, so, okay. All right, so question here. So you wrote a biography about Frank Church. How do you think he would have responded to this information overload in social media? So, harken back to when he was, in DC. What would his response be if he was there today?
Well, I think he'd be tremendously dismayed. Frank Church had a tremendous faith in the people, and he was so bright. He was so intelligent, frankly, and I think if he hadn't been a U.S. senator, he would have been a college professor, or he would have been a philosopher, or he would have been an essay writer. I mean, he was such a great writer, such a great orator, and he really believed in information. And Church, in many ways, benefited from the changes in the media. He knew how to use television. He would buy time on television and not just 30-second promos. He would actually buy time to sit down and help educate people about the issues, because he believed in education, and he believed the people were capable. If given the right information, they would be capable of making the right decision. He believed that to his core. So I think he would be tremendously dismayed at how the media has been used now, and the new media has been abused now, and how the American people have lost faith in information. I think this would be one of the things he'd be most concerned about.
Yeah. Well, let's move on, Jen, and let's talk about people's viewpoint of the legitimacy of elections, because I just mentioned that's this fair process and empowered citizenry, right? That's part of the election process. So let's see what Idahoans had to say about elections.
Absolutely. So we started first with an agreement-disagreement request about a certain statement. The statement was claims that November 2020 U.S. presidential election had widespread election fraud, and the results were not decided fairly, undermine my confidence in democracy. So were the claims about the November 2020 election, did that undermine someone's confidence in democracy? And we learned that over half of adults in Idaho agree with this statement, that these claims about the legitimacy really negatively impacted their confidence in democracy. These claims seem to have impacted perceptions of Republicans more so than Democrats. 79% of Idaho Republicans agree with this statement, compared to 28% of Democrats. So then we asked, well, despite these claims, do you personally think that the 2020 election was legitimate or not? And Idaho adults are divided on the legitimacy of the last election. 45% say they either definitely or maybe believe Biden legitimately defeated Trump. 44% say they maybe don't or definitely don't believe the last election was legitimate. And when we break out that exact same question by party ID, we can visually see some pretty stark differences. Democrats in Idaho are pretty sure of themselves. 87% say Biden definitely, legitimately defeated Trump in the November 2020 presidential election. In comparison, half of Republicans say the election definitely was not legitimate, and 21%, an additional 21%, say it may not have been. Independents are a little bit more divided. So 51% say that they believe the election was legitimate, while 32% say they don't think it was. So we wanted to know why. We asked adults in Idaho if they think each of the following happened in the November 2020 presidential election. So did people vote illegally? Was the election rigged? Were people discouraged or prevented from voting? Was there foreign interference in the election? And half or more Republicans, those that are more skeptical about the legitimacy of the election, say they believe all of the tested actions happened in the 2020 election. Most Democrats in Idaho say, probably not. They don't really think that these things happened. The one exception to that is the test that we did for voter suppression. So 45% of Democrats in Idaho say they think people were discouraged or prevented from voting. Moving on to some post-election events, we asked if adults in Idaho felt the actions of those responsible for violence at the U.S. Capitol were justified or not. 15% of adults in Idaho believe the actions of those at the Capitol were justified. But the strong majority say no, definitely not. 57% say no, definitely not. 72% say no, probably not. No, definitely not. If we break that out by party ID, Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to say that the actions were not justified. About 28% of Republicans say that the actions were justified. And then finally, we asked who was most responsible for that violence. We gave a couple of different choices, the ones that you see here. And out of the options tested, Idaho adults are most likely to say former President Donald Trump was most responsible for the violence at the US Capitol. As expected, Democrats are really driving that sentiment. 81% of Democrats say Donald Trump was responsible, compared to just 14% of Republicans in Idaho who say the same. I'm going to pause before we move into our last section about finding common ground and strengthening democracy.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, for presenting that information. And we really were curious about this most recent election. What were people's kind of experiences and perceptions about what had happened? And Rod, what do you make of the issue of voter fraud and Idaho's responses to how that made them feel about democracy?
Well, Vanessa, it's not surprisingly, because we're a Republican state, a large swath of Idahoans don't think that the election was legitimate. And that probably echoes what their leaders are saying. It probably echoes what they're watching on their chosen media outlet. And it's not surprising, even leaders in Idaho. I mean, Idaho is one of the states that filed the lawsuit or joined the lawsuit to legitimize the election. Our attorney general did not participate in that, but our governor did. And so the leadership of the Republican Party has reinforced the idea that this was not a legitimate election. And many Republican leaders have just stayed silent on it. So I'm not surprised that so many Idahoans question the election. What's really scary is that this is the first election, at least in modern American history, that this number of people felt like the election was stolen or somehow was not a legitimate election. And when you start that number of people believing that, it is the first major step toward undermining our democracy. And the last time that a lot of people questioned whether an election was legitimate or not was 2000, when some people on the Democratic side feel like the Supreme Court essentially swung that election to George W. Bush. But what tempered that election was that Al Gore, right away after the Supreme Court decision, conceded the election to George Bush. So it sort of tamped down, if you will, that whole case of whether it was legitimate or illegitimate. And that's in the rearview mirror for most Americans now, right? But because as recently as yesterday, the former president was doing an interview talking about how the election was rigged and how it was stolen. So because of that kind of beating that drum, so many people believe that the election was not legitimate, and very unfortunate for American democracy.
Yeah, and I think it's if we go back to the use of media. One of the pieces that when we look at the media and its role in a strong democracy, the media really shouldn't be politicized, right? Media itself, right? And we see that in our country, and it's not just one side, but we do have prominent people in both parties that are able to have a stage on different media outlets. And so that kind of disempowers the media to be able to have that fair viewpoint. But also when it comes to providing confusion about whether things are legitimate or not. We want to trust in the process. And if we don't trust in the process, then that weakens our democracy. So I think that's just exactly what you pointed out, right? So there's this mistrust, and it's either what is causing it? Is it the truth? And some people don't know. Is it the truth? Is it rhetoric? And that just creates a confusion in itself, right? We can't, there isn't a really common understanding that we see, at least in our results here, between people that whether or not the election was fair.
Yeah, Vanessa, we've had 3 presidential elections in the 21st century that in one way or another brings into question the state of democracy. The first one I mentioned was George Bush and Al Gore, where Bush lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote narrowly. Then fast forward to 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and Donald Trump won the electoral vote. And then fast forward to the 2020 election, where before it was even before people went to the polls, Donald Trump was declaring it a rigged election, and has continued to beat that drum, and other Republicans and media personalities have beat that drum ever since. And so it's hard to believe, but in 3 of our presidential elections in this century, there's been controversy over whether democracy really worked or not. And I'm curious about, very few people are criticizing the Electoral College, which I find kind of curious given the fact that at least twice in this century, a majority of people in this country have elected a different person, but the Electoral College overruled that. And that didn't happen so many times in American history where the person that got the popular vote lost the presidential election. It's really has escalated in this century. So I can see where people believe that in Idaho, especially because it's such a Republican state, that it wasn't a legitimate election.
Yeah, and then before we move on to our hopeful section, I just wanted to touch on the events of January 6th. And we did see, this is going to be our first kind of little glimmer of hope, right? We did see some commonality in how people felt about those events. And so what do you see here on the slide of Jen's?
Well, I see good things and I see bad things. I see hopeful things that such an overwhelming percentage thought that the violence was not justified. But it's kind of scary to me that you had 15% who said it was either definitely or probably justified. And then you have this 13%. You're always going to have a certain percent that doesn't know, right? But 13% said that they didn't know whether the violence was justified or not. I mean, that's amazing. That means 28% over 1 in 4 Americans, or Idahoans, I should say, either don't know whether it was justified or think it was justified. I mean, that's pretty scary. If you're sitting around a table having dinner and there's 4 Idahoans there, at least 1 out of those 4 people probably thought that what happened January 6th was pretty good, or didn't know whether it was pretty good, even though they saw the video and the results of it. So it's good news, it's bad news. I mean, I'd rather see that like 100% of people saying it was not, violence is never justified, but that's probably too much to ask for.
Right. And that I was at a conference yesterday and it was focused on the real estate industry. And one of the questions that it was PricewaterhouseCoopers who had done some surveying of the industry across the country. And one of the questions they asked was, what might be threatening the industry in 2022? And the third highest concern was this politicization and this imbalance and this kind of fear, right? And first I thought, well, why would that, why would they think that would affect? I was like, oh, well, if we actually don't have a democracy, what does that do to our economy, right? And I think I sometimes take too far of a step back to realize maybe how scared not just everyday people are, but the people that are industry leaders were, right, in that event.
Well, Bill Fish made this point on the morning session. He worked for Frank Church, then became a prominent business leader. And I can say this since I represent, a business group. Business wants stability. They want to know that they want stability in taxes. They want stability in government services. They just want stability. And if our democracy goes down the drain, in many ways, our economy will go down the drain. Mm-hmm. And all you have to do is look at other countries where totalitarian regimes have taken over, or where there's sort of a lip service to democracy, where the strong person, usually a man, sort of runs these mock elections, right? There's no stability in those countries. There's no law and order in those countries. And if we undermine our democracy, we are undermining our economy and our business community as well. And so I'll tell you, the business leaders in Idaho that I brush shoulders with a lot of them, they're more concerned about what's going on in Idaho right now than I've ever seen them. If you look at the last legislative session, it was the ugliest legislative session I've ever seen, and the worst. And the business community was very dismayed at what was going on in the legislature. And we're seeing a little bit of that this special session, where they're essentially attacking the private sector when the private sector is trying to keep their employees safe and keep their businesses open. And so I think the business community is extremely concerned about what's going on in this country, both in Washington with the gridlock and the dysfunction that's going on in Washington. But that same dysfunction is now starting to appear in Boise and other state capitals. And unfortunately, it's starting to creep up in our local elections too. I think November 2nd was just the tip of the iceberg when, we've got to reverse this trend where local elections become big partisan elections and dysfunctional elections. And dysfunction in the way that basically people are getting elected that want to burn things down instead of build things up.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of building things up, Rod,
yeah,
we're gonna find some common ground here in our last section. So let's see, Jen, show us the finding common ground section. Let's see what we can see. Where do we find hope in these survey results?
Okay, so I'm sorry to say we have a few more slides that may be a little bit concerning, but I promise we will get to the solutions and hopeful piece. But just setting the stage a little bit for the communication that's happening right now in the country. We asked a couple of questions about the ability of Americans to connect and find common ground, especially those with different political views. So we asked a question, do you believe that Americans of different political viewpoints have a difficult or easy time talking to one another about politics? 4 and 5 say Americans of different political viewpoints generally have a hard time talking to one another about about politics. Then we got a little bit more specific, a little bit more personal by asking how often do you and how often do American adults do things like listen to people with the same political views, listen to people with different political views, find common ground, shift their own opinion or shift somebody else's opinion. And while Idaho adults are ready for dialogue, about 80% say that they listen to people with different political views and find common ground on political views, at least sometimes. They perceive others, American adults generally, to be less willing. So Idaho adults are more likely to say that they themselves listen to people with different political views and find common ground, at least sometimes, compared to how they perceive American adults generally. But here's where we get to some of the good stuff. Like we saw this morning, Idaho adults are holding their elected officials to a higher standard, and they're prioritizing finding common ground. So when we asked, thinking about what you want out of an elected official, which of these attributes is more important to you? We see that 70% of adults in Idaho say it's more important to have somebody, an elected official, who finds compromise and common ground, compared to an elected official who stands their ground and pushes their party's own agenda. And this includes a bipartisan majority. So Democrats, independents, and Republicans all want an elected official who will find common ground. And before I turn it back over to the panelists, I also want to talk about some additional solutions that Idaho adults have commented on to help strengthen democracy. So finally, these are the real solutions. We asked, from the following list of options, what do you believe, if anything, would help strengthen democracy in the US? And we allowed adults in Idaho to select as many options as they wanted to. We only are showing the options that we got responses above 25%, just because we want to stay focused on the top responses. This top responses are the most selected responses that we saw, really focused on structural reforms, like holding politicians accountable for illegal or unethical behavior, holding them accountable for campaign promises, instituting term limits, reducing the amount of money in politics, reducing the spread of misinformation, which we saw was a real concern for people. But there are also more grassroots solutions, like encouraging conversation between individuals with different political views or adding more civics education in school. We took this question one step further and we asked, which of the following do you believe would be most likely to help strengthen democracy in the US? So this was, we gave the audience, or we gave the respondents the exact same list of options, but we only allowed them to select up to 3 options. They had to choose which they thought would be most likely to help. And again, we see most of those big, bold policy reforms rising to the top. Those are, perceived as being potentially very impactful. So things like term limits and accountability and reducing the spread of misinformation. But we also see other options like encouraging higher voter turnout and encouraging conversation between individuals with different viewpoints rising to the top as well. So really quite a few options that Idaho adults think could help strengthen the health of democracy in the US. So I'm definitely interested to see, Vanessa and Rod, what you think about these options.
Thanks so much, Jen. And really nice that we can wrap up our conversation today and think about, okay, how can we at Boise State, at Frank Church Institute, maybe Idaho Policy Institute, how can we learn from this and think how we can strengthen democracy in the state? So Rod, what do you see that's promising in this last set of slides?
Vanessa, it's so nice to end on a high note, isn't it? Most of the survey, it was kind of depressing, but these last few slides, I think, can give us hope. One of my favorite writers, Wallace Stigner, said that the West is the native home of hope. And I love that because the survey is basically based on 5 Western states. So what's really encouraging about these numbers is that 70% of the people really want their politicians to find common ground. And a very small percentage of people want them to stand their ground, vote the party line, and not try to find common ground. So for any politician out there who's in office or aspiring politician, if you start talking about compromise, you talk about finding common ground, it's going to be a winning position with the people. 70%, which includes a lot of Republicans in that, Democrats and independents. I will say, since this is the Frank Church Conference, that Frank Church probably more than any political person I've ever known, and there's exceptions, but probably more than anybody I've known, he really worked across the aisle on almost every piece of major legislation he sponsored. He had a Republican co-sponsor. There was one special committee that he was asked to chair by Mike Mansfield, and he said he would only take the chairmanship if Mac Mathias would be named co-chair, Republican Senator Mac Mathias. And then there's this famous picture of Church and Mathias having a gavel, and it was split down the middle, and each of them was holding one half of the gavel, and they were both smiling. And it was that kind of work that we used to see in Congress, used to see in the U.S. Senate, used to see in the Idaho legislature, where you had Cecil Andrus and Phil Batt working together. When Cecil Andrus had this big computer problem in one of his terms as governor, he personally asked Phil Batt to chair the committee to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. And Batt could have easily politicized that, right? Because he was chair of the Republican Party at the time. But he didn't take advantage of that. He worked with Cease on that. And so there was a time in politics, both in Washington and in Idaho, where people worked together and they found common ground and they got a lot done. Peter made the point this morning that the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 65 would have never passed without Everett Dirksen, the minority leader of the U.S. Senate, because he brought the Republicans along that got that bill through, because the Southern Democrats were all voting against it. So compromise, which the founding fathers expected, has always been at the root of making our democracy work, and we have lost that. So this is really encouraging to see 7 out of 10 Idahoans say, no, we want you to work together. Now, the challenge, Vanessa, is how do we do that? How do we make our political leaders work together when we want them to work together and they refuse to work together? How do we enforce some discipline there? I don't know how we're going to do that, but one thing is, when every candidate stands in front of our voters, one of the key questions should be, what bill sponsored by the opposite party are you willing to find common ground on and vote for? That should be a key question every single time people meet either a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate. What bill are you willing to support the other side on that they've proposed that you can find common ground on?
Rod, when it comes to just our local communities, right, if we can find social cohesion locally, I like to think we can kind of grow that up, right? Are you seeing places in Idaho where we're seeing more social cohesion at the local level, perhaps, or maybe there's an issue that you'll see in the State House this coming session that, is there an opportunity to kind of have that cohesion from both parties? Do you see any promise there?
There's always opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine used to say, the only thing standing between you and me is opportunity. And so I think when people are of goodwill, there's always opportunity. But Vanessa, and I know this is supposed to be our positive, right? But I would say I actually see things deteriorating in Idaho. Unfortunately, and I've touched on this a couple times, the kind of dysfunction we've seen in Washington has eventually made it to Idaho. This, what I call the dysfunction on the Potomac, is now being seen in dysfunction along the Boise. But really what disturbs me is the dysfunction I'm starting to see at the local level. I think we're actually, all the dysfunction that we've been seeing is now kind of drifting down the local level. It's because I think the pandemic has sparked that, but it's kind of the mood too, where people just aren't listening to each other, even at the local level. Look at what's going on in Boise. Look at what's going on at school board meetings, and where people rushed the Coeur d'Alene school district and they had to close their meeting, and then the crowd rushed over to the district headquarters and crashed through the district headquarters, and the police had to escort the staff of the Coeur d'Alene school district out of their building for their own safety. I mean, you would have never seen that in Idaho 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, ever. What's happening in our state is very, very troublesome. And unfortunately, I think we're moving in the wrong direction. But this survey tells us that Idahoans really want people to work together. So there's this disconnect between what we're seeing on the ground and what people are saying in this survey.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think what we're seeing on the ground is really what I would call the tyranny of the minority, right? So sometimes if you're at a council meeting or you see, it's not the majority of the people that are out there that are loud, right? We're seeing this vocal minority. You could pick either side, right? That are ones that get the attention of the media. They're the ones that are the bad actors. And this is my glass half full. I think that's actually the minority. That tyranny of the minority is getting the attention of the media. They're the ones that they're pushing their viewpoints out on social media. And so, and I like to, someone else I like to kind of think about is Stephen Covey and the whole, his concept of seek first to understand and then be understood. So how can I really try to find any ounce of empathy for this minority who truly feels that way? And how can is there ability for me to find common ground with them? I like to think that really everyone in Idaho cares about Idaho, right? We all love the state. And so how can we find common ground at least there and then build off of it? I think we all want a strong economy. We all want opportunities for our children. We just disagree on how to get to each of those, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm a half glass full sort of person too. And so I agree with you. I don't think that what we're seeing in the streets represents the majority of Idahoans. But it's the majority of Idahoans who have to start exerting themselves, right? Because this other group, they can easily take over the state if people are not aware. And I can tell you, there's school boards in Idaho that will be highly dysfunctional in the years ahead because of the vote on November 2nd. I hope that doesn't happen. But people of goodwill, this 70%, they have to get engaged, they have to get organized, and they have to take their state back. Because right now, and I agree, it's a minority, they're getting more and more powerful in our state.
Mm-hmm. And I think conversations like we're having today about the results of this particular survey, the Idaho Policy Institute will be working with other faculty in the School of Public Service. We'll do our public opinion survey that's going to be coming out this January. Another place, hopefully, to have a conversation about what we're seeing in the state and the opportunity to find common ground. We have our new Institute for American Values that's launching here at Boise State that is going to help hold conversations between people of different viewpoints. And so I can at least look at the university and say, I think we're trying to do our best to listen and to have civil conversation. Love to see that moving forward, and really excited to see what Frank Church Institute does next with the results of this survey. I think it's the first of its kind that you all have sponsored and done. And so maybe I can put it out there. Maybe this is going to be a regular thing every couple of years, right? And to see maybe this will change over time. Maybe we'll next year we'll come back, Rod, and we'll be able to see how things have changed for the better.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's any other questions out there from the crowd, but it looks like it's about time for us to wrap up. So, Rod, do you have any parting thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I just, one thing we didn't touch on, Vanessa, was some of the things that people of Idaho think can strengthen democracy. And I hope they go to our website and look at page 34, because there's some really great ideas there where we can implement those things. We can get our elected officials to implement those things. And the last thing I just want to say, I can't let go without saying, as somebody who cares so deeply about education, I think we've got to do a better job at teaching civics and history in our schools from K through higher education. It doesn't do any good if we have a bunch of well-educated STEM folks if we don't have citizens who also understand how government works and don't understand how to get engaged to make our democracy work. Without our democracy, we don't have anything else in this country. And so civics and teaching history, I think we've got to get back to teaching those basics in our education system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, without an engaged citizenry, right? They're going to feel disempowered, right? And they're not going to know how to help strengthen democracy. So,
right.
Yeah, so make sure everyone to go to the Frank Church Institute's website. You can see the slides that were presented today. I think Rod was just pointing to one of them that shows those places of opportunity that we have to strengthen our democracy. And I think I could say thanks again to the Frank Church Institute for the sponsors of today's events. And again, looking forward to hopefully having this conversation continue in the future.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Gary.
Scott Perrin, our producer, Chase Johnson, our webmaster, Jim Munkris, and our administrative assistant, Valerie Hayes, for all your good work. If you appreciate these programs, please go to the Frank Church Institute website to contribute. Follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This concludes the Frank Church Conference. Thank you.